At 4:17 in the morning on January 12, 1944, near the edge of the Hukong Valley in northern Burma, a U.S. Army engineer corporal stood ankle-deep in black mud with one hand pressed against the side of a bulldozer that was no longer moving. The machine had gone silent. A few seconds earlier, its engine had been coughing under the rain, the heavy blade buried in a wall of wet earth and broken roots. Now there was only the sound of water striking steel. Rain fell through the jungle canopy in uneven sheets, dripping from vines, pooling in tire tracks, running down the necks of men who had already forgotten what dry clothing felt like. The corporal leaned close to the engine housing. His fingers were slick with oil. A flashlight beam trembled over bolts, mud, and torn metal. Somewhere behind him, a truck driver cursed softly as his wheels sank deeper into the road that was not yet a road. Somewhere ahead, beyond the cut trees, the jungle was dark enough to hide anything. Patrol, a sniper, a Japanese machine gun team waiting for the first shape of morning. No one spoke loudly. Men learned that in Burma, sound behaved differently under the trees. A dropped wrench seemed too sharp. A whispered order seemed to hang in the air. The jungle did not feel empty. It felt occupied, even when no one could see movement. The bulldozer mattered more than it should have. Behind it stood trucks loaded with fuel drums, rations, ammunition, bridge timbers, spare parts, and men who had been told to keep moving because the road had to keep moving. Ahead lay a strip of jungle still uncut, still owned by roots and rain and insects and the quiet pressure of an enemy that believed terrain could do half the fighting for them. The Japanese had reason to believe that. Burma had already swallowed armies. It had broken columns, exhausted soldiers, erased maps, and turned distance into punishment. A mile could take a day. A river could stop a division. A rainstorm could destroy more progress than artillery. Men came into the jungle with rifles and left it with fever. Trucks bogged down. Bridges vanished. Trails became brown water. Boots rotted. Skins split. Radios failed. Maps lied. To Japanese commanders, this was not merely terrain. It was protection. The jungle was their shield. They believed the Americans and their allies could bomb from above, land troops on beaches, build factories an ocean away, and pour out tanks, ships, guns, and aircraft in numbers Japan could not match. But here, in northern Burma, all that industrial strength had to pass through mud. It had to cross rivers. It had to survive monsoon rain. It had to fit between mountains and trees. It had to breathe in a place where men struggled to breathe. And if it could not move, it could not matter. That was the belief. It was not foolish. It was not childish. It was built from experience. The jungle had already punished the British. It had cut China off from land supply. It had turned retreat into misery. It had made even simple movement feel like an operation. But in the rain before dawn, beside a dead bulldozer, another truth was being tested. The Japanese had understood the jungle as a barrier. The engineers understood it as a problem. A cruel problem. A murderous problem. But still a problem. The corporal reached deeper into the engine compartment. Someone held the flashlight closer. The beam caught the rain, then the side of his face. His eyes were red from smoke and sleeplessness. He was not a general. He was not the kind of man whose name would appear in large print on a map-room wall. He was one of thousands of men whose work would be reduced later to miles completed, bridges built, culverts laid, tons delivered. But at that moment, the campaign depended on something painfully small. A belt, a fuel line, a cracked fitting, a machine that had to start again. The driver climbed back into the seat. The corporal stepped clear, slapped the steel twice, and nodded. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the engine turned. It coughed once, spat smoke, and came alive with a low metallic growl that seemed too loud for the jungle. Men looked toward the tree line. No shot came. The blade dropped again. The bulldozer lurched forward, shuddering, clawing, dragging the unfinished road a few more feet into a place the Japanese believed no army could truly enter. That was how the shield began to fail. Not with one dramatic explosion. Not with a single heroic charge. But with engines restarted in the rain. With men pushing steel through mud. with a road that should not have existed moving one machine length farther into the dark. And the enemy still did not fully understand what that meant. Not yet. The jungle would fight for Japan. To understand why the Japanese trusted the jungle, it is necessary to look at Burma not as a place on a map, but as a force. On paper, northern Burma could be reduced to lines, names, rivers, valleys, ridges, and supply routes. In a headquarters, it could be marked in grease pencil. A commander could point to a valley, circle a town, draw an arrow, and speak of movement. But the jungle did not obey arrows. It resisted them. The air was heavy. The ground shifted underfoot. Water collected where roads were supposed to hold. Leeches found skin through cloth. Mosquitoes came in clouds. Men sweated through uniforms before sunrise and shivered under fever by nightfall. Metal rusted. Leather softened. Paper turned weak. Rifle oil mixed with mud. A wound that might have been manageable somewhere else could become infected here with frightening speed. Japanese soldiers knew how to live closer to this environment than many of their opponents. They moved with less. They used trails. They carried loads through country that seemed to have no path at all. They understood concealment, patience, and the psychological weight of unseen danger. A shot from a green wall could stop a whole column. A few men with a machine gun at a bend in the trail could make the jungle feel as if it had teeth. The Japanese command structure also understood something basic about modern armies. They were hungry machines. An army did not live on courage alone. It needed rice, meat, fuel, ammunition, batteries, medical supplies, radio parts, spare tires, bridge material, maps, stretchers, and men healthy enough to carry all of it. The larger the army, the more it needed. The more mechanized it became, the more vulnerable it was to the failure of roads. The Americans possessed overwhelming industrial capacity, but industry was far away. It sat in factories across the Pacific, in shipyards, depots, ports, railheads, and supply bases. To matter in Burma, it had to arrive at the front. That meant it had to move through one of the worst regions in the world for movement. The Japanese believed that was where American strength would weaken. They believed trucks would bog down. They believed artillery would arrive too slowly. They believed aircraft could harass but not replace land supply. They believed Chinese forces fighting in the theater would remain limited by what could be carried to them. They believed the jungle would separate Allied power into pieces. And at first, the evidence seemed to support them. The Allied retreat from Burma in 1942 had been a warning written in hunger, exhaustion, and abandoned equipment. The loss of the old Burma Road had severed a vital land artery into China. Soldiers and civilians had struggled through miserable tracks under pressure, pursued by the enemy and punished by the land itself. That retreat did not fade quickly from memory. It taught commanders that Burma could defeat plans even before the enemy did. For Japan, the country's terrain became part of the defensive system. Rivers were not only rivers. They were delays. Mountains were not only mountains. They were walls. Mud was not only mud. It was a weapon that did not need ammunition. The jungle offered concealment to small units and confusion to large ones. A defender could vanish. An attacker had to expose himself by moving, cutting, building, bridging, shouting, starting engines, and placing men along routes that could be watched. Every road became a promise and a target. Every convoy announced where the Allies intended to go. That confidence reached beyond Burma. It belonged to a broader Japanese belief about will and endurance. They had seen Western forces struggle in tropical conditions. They had seen how quickly supply problems could become morale problems. They had seen how difficult it was for large formations to operate when the land itself refused cooperation. And there was another assumption beneath it. The Japanese believed they could endure hardship better. Not always comfortably, not without cost, but with fewer demands, fewer machines, and a harder tolerance for deprivation. They believed they could make the jungle favor them. If the Americans required roads, depots, and heavy equipment, then the destruction of roads and the absence of roads would become a defense in itself. There was truth in this. A soldier without food cannot fight for long. A truck without fuel is only weight. A gun without shells is only metal. A wounded man without evacuation is a burden on every man around him. In Burma, these truths appeared every day, not as theory but as fatigue on faces. Japanese commanders did not need to destroy every Allied unit. They only needed to slow them, stretch them, isolate them, and make the jungle finish what bullets began. But the belief had a blind spot. It assumed the jungle would remain mostly unchanged. It assumed roads were fixed things, present or absent, usable or impossible. It assumed the Allies would be forced to accept the terrain as they found it. The men arriving with survey equipment, bulldozers, graders, bridge cables, culverts, blasting charges, and repair crews had a different view. They did not look at the jungle and see a shield. They saw grade angles, water flow, soil failure, timber strength, engine strain, and places where a road might be forced into existence if enough men were willing to pay the price. That was the part the Japanese had not fully measured. The jungle could fight for Japan, but it could also be changed by men who understood that in modern war, the road itself could become a weapon. And soon, the war in northern Burma would turn on whether that weapon could be built fast enough. China was being strangled. Beyond the rain and the trees, beyond the patrols and the broken trails, Burma mattered because China was being slowly squeezed. For years, China had absorbed Japanese pressure across a vast and brutal war. Its armies needed rifles, ammunition, vehicles, radios, medical supplies, and fuel. Its government needed to remain in the fight. Its continued resistance forced Japan to hold enormous commitments on the Asian mainland. For the Allies, keeping China supplied was not an act of sentiment. It was strategy. But strategy depends on routes. And routes can be cut. When Japan seized Burma and the Burma Road was lost, one of the most important land supply lines into China was severed. What remained was the air route over the eastern Himalayas, the flight path that crews came to know as the hump. Cargo aircraft lifted from bases in India and flew into weather, mountains, icing, turbulence, navigation problems, and Japanese threat. The flights were dangerous, exhausting, and often deadly. Each aircraft could carry only so much. Each gallon of fuel consumed in flight reduced what could be delivered. Each crash was not just the loss of a crew, but the loss of engines, cargo, time, and hope. The mathematics were cruel. China needed more than aircraft could easily provide. A land route had to be restored. That need became the pressure behind the road from Ledo in Assam toward Burma and eventually toward a connection with the old Burma Road into China. It was a plan that looked bold on a map and punishing on the ground. To build it, engineers would have to push through mountains, jungle, valleys, river crossings, and disease zones while combat operations unfolded nearby. The road was sometimes called a lifeline, but that word can make it sound clean. A lifeline is usually imagined as something thin and simple, a rope thrown to a drowning man. The road through northern Burma was not simple. It was a wound cut through jungle, kept open by machines, sweat, gravel, timber, fuel, and discipline. It had to be defended. It had to be drained. It had to be rebuilt after weather. It had to survive the weight of war. To Japanese planners, this difficulty was part of the security of their position. The Allies might want to supply China by land. Wanting and doing were different things. A road could not be wished through Burma. It had to be surveyed foot by foot. Trees had to fall. Roots had to be torn out. Hillsides had to be cut. Soft ground had to be stabilized. Bridges had to be built in places where rivers rose violently after rain. Culverts had to carry water away before the road dissolved. Trucks had to be kept moving over surfaces that the jungle tried to reclaim almost immediately. The hidden problem was not only construction. It was time. Every month China remained undersupplied mattered. Every delay gave Japan more space. Every aircraft lost over the hump reminded Allied commanders that air supply alone could not solve the entire problem. Every ton delivered by air proved courage, but also revealed limitation. The road had to answer what aircraft could not. Yet road building in Burma was unlike construction in a peaceful country. The engineers were not working behind a safe fence. They were building into a campaign. Combat units had to clear areas. Patrols had to protect workers. Japanese forces could strike at weak points. A bridge could be destroyed. A road crew could be ambushed. A rainstorm could do in one night what enemy fire had failed to do in a week. On the Japanese side, the logic was simple. The longer the Allies took, the more the jungle served its purpose. Delay was defense. Mud was defense. Distance was defense. And in headquarters far from the worst of the mud, men argued over value, priority, and feasibility. Would the road be finished in time to matter? Would the cost justify the result? Could the same resources be better spent elsewhere? Would air supply make the road unnecessary before it was complete? These questions mattered. They were not the complaints of cowards or fools. War is always a struggle over limited resources, even for industrial powers. Ships, aircraft, engineers, fuel, steel, and men sent to one theater cannot be used in another. The road through Burma demanded belief of its own, belief that the future value would justify the immediate suffering. For the men in the jungle, the debate became simpler. There was mud in front of them. There were orders behind them. There was a machine that had to be repaired before the next convoy arrived. They could not decide grand strategy. They could only make the next mile possible. That is how enormous historical decisions often reach ordinary men. Not as speeches, not as doctrine, not as clean lines on a map, as a broken truck, as a bridge cable too short, as a fever that will not break, as a roadbed collapsing under the weight of the first vehicle meant to prove it can hold. The Japanese believed that if they could keep China isolated and force Allied supply into the sky, geography would continue to serve them. But geography was about to be challenged by men whose battlefield was measured not in yards captured from an enemy trench, but in yards cut from the jungle itself. The next question was not whether the road was important. It was whether the kind of men assigned to build it could survive the place long enough to make importance real. The men with bulldozers. The men who built the road did not arrive in Burma with the romance of cavalry charges or fighter aces. They came with grease under their nails. They came with wrenches, survey rods, blasting caps, saws, shovels, graders, cranes, bulldozers, trucks, and crates of parts that were never enough. Some had worked around machinery before the war. Some had learned in uniform. Some were mechanics by instinct, the kind of men who could hear something wrong in an engine before anyone else knew to worry. Others were drivers, bridge men, demolition specialists, cooks, medics, clerks, and laborers turned into road builders by necessity. Many of them served in units that history would remember only in fragments. An engineer regiment here, a construction battalion there, a company assigned to a stretch of road whose name would mean little to anyone outside the campaign. They were not unimportant. They were simply easy to overlook. War stories often move toward the loudest violence. The machine gun nest, the bomber stream, the tank duel, the beach landing, the last stand. Engineers worked in a slower violence. Their enemies were not only Japanese bullets but failing soil, disease, rain, machinery fatigue, and the steady erosion of human strength. They lived with sound. The cough of diesel engines in wet air. The metallic strike of tools against pins and plates. The thud of felled trees. The scrape of bulldozer blades. The sudden crack of rifle fire somewhere beyond visibility. The sickening groan of a bridge taking weight for the first time. A rifleman might measure danger by what he could see ahead. An engineer often measured it by what might fail underneath. A culvert placed badly could wash out a section of road. A bridge built too weak could collapse under a loaded truck. A slope cut too steep could slide after rain. A drainage ditch ignored for one day could become a stream running straight down the roadbed. In Burma, mistakes were not always dramatic at first. They accumulated quietly, then punished everyone at once. The engineers learned to see the jungle differently from other soldiers. An infantryman looked for movement in the trees. An officer looked at the map and searched for routes. An engineer looked at water. Where would it go when the rain came? Where would it collect? Where would it undercut the road? Where would it soften the ground until wheels sank to the axle? Where could timber be cut? Where could stone be found? Where could a truck turn around if the forward section failed? These questions were not glamorous. They were survival. Japanese commanders believed the jungle imposed fixed limits on Allied movement. Engineers lived by the opposite assumption. The jungle imposed problems, and problems could sometimes be solved if paid for in labor, time, and risk. Not always. No serious engineer believed the jungle could simply be conquered. The men working there knew better than anyone how fragile their work was. They saw roads vanish under rain. They saw machines sink. They saw men go pale with malaria. They watched crews return from the line with fewer men than they had taken out. They knew that every mile forward stretched them thinner. But they also knew something commanders sometimes forgot. The battlefield was not only shaped by plans. It was shaped by repair. A tank can be powerful, but someone must get fuel to it. A gun can be accurate, but someone must move shells to it. A soldier can be brave, but someone must evacuate him when he is hit. A campaign can be drawn in arrows, but those arrows mean little if the wheels cannot turn. The engineers were the men who made arrows possible. Their work demanded a patience that war rarely celebrates. A destroyed bridge could mean hours of planning, cutting, hauling, fitting, and testing under pressure. A stuck bulldozer could stop more than a machine. It could stop an entire sequence of movement. When equipment broke, repair crews did not wait for ideal conditions. They worked in rain, in mud, under canvas if canvas existed, under open sky if it did not. A man might lie beneath a truck with water running under his back while another held a flashlight in his teeth. A mechanic might remove a part from one dead machine to keep another alive. A driver might move forward knowing the road beneath him was new, soft, and barely trusted. Fear did not always announce itself. Sometimes it appeared as silence before a truck crossed a bridge. Sometimes as the way men stopped joking when the jungle became too still. Sometimes as the quick glance toward the trees after an engine backfired. And yet the work continued. That was the underestimated thing. Japanese forces had seen Allied armies depend on roads. They had seen dependency as weakness. But in the hands of engineers, road dependency became road creation. The Americans did not merely need roads. They brought men trained to make them where none existed. Still, the idea remained nearly absurd. Build a route through country that swallowed movement. Do it while the enemy watched. Do it while rain destroyed yesterday's labor. Do it fast enough to matter before the strategic situation changed again. The men with bulldozers were not asked to win fame. They were asked to make the impossible look, mile by mile, like routine work. And that may have been the most dangerous kind of challenge to Japanese confidence. Not a dramatic announcement that the jungle had been beaten, but the low mechanical growl of another blade pushing forward where no road had been the day before. Drive a highway through the green wall. The idea sounded simple only to someone who had never stood in the jungle. Build a road from Ledo. Push it through northern Burma. Connect it toward China. Use it to carry the supplies that aircraft could not carry in sufficient quantity. On a staff map, the concept had a certain brutal elegance. A line could be drawn. A direction could be assigned. A destination could be circled. The map did not show the full weight of heat, sickness, landslides, swollen streams, broken equipment, or the way jungle returns almost immediately to any space left unattended. A road is not merely empty ground. It is a system. It requires a surface strong enough for repeated traffic. It requires drainage because water is often more destructive than enemy fire. It requires bridges, culverts, turnouts, maintenance crews, fuel points, repair areas, security, communication, and constant attention. In Burma, it also required the acceptance that nothing stayed finished for long. A cut hillside could slide. A stream could rise. A log bridge could rot. A roadbed could soften. A truck could break through and block the route for everything behind it. The Japanese understood some of this. That was why they trusted the jungle. They did not have to defeat every engineer. They only had to let Burma do what Burma did. To build a road, there was to challenge not one obstacle but thousands. There were trees thick enough to slow machinery. Vines that tangled men and equipment. Soil that changed character with rain. Valleys where fog sat heavy. Rivers that appeared manageable until the weather changed upstream. Malaria zones. Dysentery. Heat that turned work into punishment. Nights filled with insects and the nervous awareness that enemy patrols could approach silently. Even the machines were not free from the campaign. Bulldozers gave the engineers power, but they also created dependence. They needed fuel, oil, parts, trained operators, mechanics, and time. Their engines breathed dust in dry spells and choked in mud during rain. Tracks wore down. Blades bent. Radiators clogged. A machine could do the work of many men, but when it failed, many men had to serve the machine. The road was therefore both an answer and a burden. Some officers questioned whether it could be completed quickly enough to justify the cost. Others worried that the route would consume resources in a theater already starved for attention. There were arguments over priorities, personality clashes, and strategic doubts. General Joseph Stilwell's name would become closely tied to the road, and with it came all the controversy of the China-Burma-India theater. Difficult alliances, hard terrain, conflicting goals, and the constant pressure to produce results in a place that resisted results. But the engineers did not live inside the argument as historians later would. They lived inside the work. A day began before full light. Men rose stiff from poor sleep. Wet boots went back onto sore feet. Engines were checked. Tools were gathered. Survey lines were pushed forward. Trees came down. Earth moved. Drainage was cut. Trucks hauled material. Cooks tried to keep men fed. Medics watched for fever. Officers checked progress against schedules that the jungle seemed determined to mock. The first miles mattered psychologically as much as physically. A road that exists for only a little distance is still a statement. Says the line has begun. It says the jungle has been entered not by a patrol that will leave, but by a system that intends to stay. Every finished stretch became both proof and invitation. More machines could come forward. More supplies could move. More men could work farther ahead. Japanese forces could still attack. The jungle could still damage. But the road changed the nature of Allied presence. Patrol passes through terrain. A road occupies it. That was the real threat. The Japanese had built much of their confidence on the idea that Allied movement would be temporary, narrow, vulnerable, and exhausting. But a road allowed movement to repeat. It turned one difficult passage into many possible passages. It gave the Allies a way to bring yesterday's labor forward into tomorrow's battle. No 1 mile won the campaign, but no campaign could ignore what repeated miles meant. Still, every new stretch carried risk. A road pushed forward faster than it could be protected was an exposed vein. Could be cut, could be shelled, could be mined, could attract attack simply by existing. The more valuable it became, the more dangerous it was to build. The engineers knew this. They did not need speeches about danger. They heard it in the sudden pause when distant firing started. They saw it in the way security patrols moved out ahead. They felt it when work continued near areas not fully safe, because waiting for perfect safety would mean never building at all. And so the ridiculous idea became daily practice. Cut, grade, drain, bridge, repair, repeat. The words are plain. The work was not. Each step pushed the Allies deeper into the Japanese assumption that geography would protect them. Each engine noise under the canopy suggested that something larger than a road was moving forward. The jungle was still a shield, but now someone was cutting a handle into it. The first miles cost everything. The first miles of road did not feel like progress. They felt like an argument with the earth. A bulldozer would push forward, its blade biting into roots and wet soil, only to stop against a buried stump that held like iron. Men would move in with axes and cables. Another machine would pull. The stump would tear loose with a sucking sound from the mud, and for a moment the roadbed would seem clear. Then rain would come. Water would run through the cut ground, find the weakest point, and begin undoing the day. The engineers learned quickly that the jungle did not resist in one dramatic act. It resisted continuously. Morning work could fail by afternoon. A newly cut section could become impassable after one storm. A truck that crossed safely once could sink on the second pass. There were days when progress was counted not in miles, but in yards no one trusted yet. The men worked under layers of threat. Japanese troops were not always visible, but invisibility was part of their power. A road crew made noise. It left tracks. It created targets. Men bent over tools could not always keep rifles ready. Drivers focused on mud could miss movement in the trees. Engineers working on a bridge had limited places to run if fire came from the far bank. Security units pushed outward, but the jungle shortened vision. A man could be close and still unseen. The first shot often came from nowhere. Then men dropped behind machines into ditches behind logs, wherever the unfinished road allowed cover. For the engineers, the boundary between construction and combat blurred. A bulldozer blade became cover. A bridge site became a firing position. A repair halt became a moment of exposure. Even silence had weight. When engines stopped, the men could hear the jungle again. Insects, rain, distant birds, water dripping from leaves. Sometimes that silence was ordinary. Sometimes it felt watched. The weather was its own commander. Rain turned dust to paste and paste to deep mud. It filled boot prints. It soaked maps. It entered engines, tents, crates, and bandages. Men worked with shirts stuck to their backs and eyes burning from sweat. Tools slipped in wet hands. Leeches appeared where men did not expect them. Mosquitoes made sleep shallow. Fever removed workers as surely as wounds. Machines suffered too. A grader could not be treated like a miracle. It had limits. Tracks wore. Engines overheated. Fuel quality mattered. Spare parts mattered more than optimism. A bulldozer that broke at the wrong place could block the very road it was meant to create. Mechanics became as important as operators. They listened to engines the way doctors listen to lungs. Sometimes they kept machines alive by improvisation. Part taken from a wreck. A repair made with tools never designed for that job. A cable reused until no one liked the look of it. A fuel line patched because replacement had not arrived. In another setting, such work might have been called unsafe. In Burma, it was often called necessary. The first construction pushes also forced a difficult coordination between combat troops and road builders. The road could not move far beyond military protection, but military operations needed the road to sustain themselves. Each depended on the other. Infantry could clear ground, but without engineers, the gain might not hold logistical meaning. Engineers could build, but without protection, their work could become a trap. In the distance, Allied and Chinese forces fought for positions that would open the route. Merrill's Marauders and other units operating in Burma endured their own exhaustion, hunger, disease, and combat. The road did not exist apart from them. It was tied to every patrol, every clearing operation, every airstrip, every supply drop, every wounded man needing evacuation. But on the road itself, war often narrowed to immediate tasks. A bridge needed to be finished before the next convoy. A washed-out section needed repair before night. A truck had to be pulled free before it blocked the line. A culvert had to be placed before the rain returned. There was a strange cruelty in that kind of urgency. The task was always practical, always concrete, always right in front of the men. Yet behind each task stood the enormous weight of strategy. If the road failed, supply failed. If supply failed, operations slowed. If operations slowed, Japanese assumptions hardened. The Japanese did not need to see every engineer to understand the threat. The road's appearance itself was evidence that something was changing. Where there had been jungle, there was now cut earth. Where there had been a stream crossing, there might now be a bridge. Where a patrol once struggled through undergrowth, trucks might soon pass. But the change was fragile. The road was born weak. Its first surfaces were vulnerable. Its bridges had to prove themselves under weight. Its drainage had to survive real rain, not theoretical rain. Its crews had to learn the country by failing in it. Every mistake cost time. Some cost lives. At night, men lay under mosquito nets, listening to rain and distant engines, knowing that the morning might reveal half their work damaged. A man could begin to hate water, not the dramatic flood, but the constant, patient water that entered every weakness and widened it. Still, they returned to the line. The blade dropped again. The saws started again. The trucks tried again. The road kept moving, not smoothly, not heroically in the clean sense, but stubbornly. That stubbornness mattered. It was the form American industry took when far from factories. Not endless abundance appearing magically at the front, but tired men forcing machines to function in a place that punished machinery. And as the first miles stretched farther, the Japanese shield began to show its first crack. Not because the jungle had become easy, because the Allies had accepted that it would never be easy, and kept building anyway. The shield became a door. The turning point did not arrive in one clean moment. There was no single morning when the jungle stopped protecting Japanese positions and began serving Allied movement. The change happened slowly, almost quietly, through repetition. A truck made it farther than before. A bridge held. A drainage ditch worked. A convoy that might once have stalled arrived with supplies. A forward unit received ammunition before the shortage became desperate. A wounded man reached care sooner than he would have months earlier. Small facts, practical facts. But in war, practical facts accumulate until they become strategic truth. The Japanese had believed the jungle would divide Allied strength. It would force men to move in narrow columns, cut them off from artillery, limit their supply, and slow every operation until momentum died. That belief had worked before. It was rooted in experience. But the road began to alter the battlefield's behavior. Movement became repeatable. That was the difference. Patrol could pass through jungle once. A road allowed trucks to pass again and again. A trail could carry men. A road could carry fuel, shells, food, radios, spare parts, medical equipment, and heavier weapons. Each convoy represented more than cargo. It represented continuity. It meant the Allied presence did not have to fade after one push. The jungle remained dangerous. Japanese soldiers remained disciplined, skilled, and deadly. Ambushes, defensive positions, and counterattacks still mattered. But the deeper problem for Japan was that terrain alone was losing its ability to isolate the enemy. This was the battlefield reality they had not fully allowed for. The Americans were not simply entering the jungle. They were changing the terms of movement inside it. The road did not remove hardship. It reorganized it. Instead of every unit carrying everything forward through punishing terrain, supplies could be staged, moved, repaired, and pushed onward in greater volume. Instead of distance being absolute, distance became something engineers could reduce by making the next mile usable. And with each mile, Japanese defensive confidence had to adjust. Positions that seemed protected by remoteness were no longer quite as remote. Areas that depended on Allied exhaustion now faced better supplied pressure. The jungle still favored concealment, but it no longer guaranteed isolation. Around Myitkyina and across northern Burma, the struggle for airfields, roads, and routes became inseparable. Myitkyina mattered not simply as a place, but as part of a network. Airfields could extend reach. Roads could sustain movement. Rivers and bridges could determine tempo. The campaign became a contest over connection. Japanese forces understood defense in depth, hardship, and sacrifice. Many fought with extraordinary endurance under terrible conditions. They were not defeated by road construction alone. No single explanation can carry the weight of Burma. Combat, air power, Chinese forces, British and Indian forces, American units, intelligence, disease, command decisions, and Japanese supply difficulties all shaped the campaign. But the road exposed a dangerous flaw in the Japanese belief. They had treated the jungle as a fixed ally. The engineers made it unstable. A shield works only if it remains between you and the enemy. But if the enemy cuts through it, bridges it, drains it, grades it, and moves supply across it, then the shield begins to serve both sides, and eventually perhaps the side with more machines, more fuel, and more capacity to repair. That was the deeper reversal. The jungle did not betray Japan. It was forced into a different role. The men who forced it were often filthy, sick, exhausted, anonymous, and angry at machines that failed too often. They were not thinking in poetic terms. A man swinging a pick in wet heat does not usually imagine he is changing the meaning of geography. A mechanic lying beneath a truck in mud does not think of doctrine. He thinks of the bolt he cannot reach, the rain in his eyes, the driver waiting above him, and the knowledge that the convoy must move. Yet doctrine was changing through such moments. The battlefield was teaching both sides that engineering could be a form of combat. Not combat as spectacle. Combat as persistence. Combat as the denial of geography's final authority. Japanese soldiers at the front may not have seen the whole transformation. They saw its symptoms. More Allied supplies. More sustained pressure. More roads where jungle had been. More aircraft supported by fields and supply systems. More enemy movement in areas that had once seemed protected by distance. By the time the full meaning became clear, the road was no longer an idea to be mocked or delayed. It was a physical fact. It could be attacked, damaged, slowed, and contested, but it could not be dismissed. The shield had become a door, and through that door came the thing Japanese planners had hoped the jungle would keep away. The weight of Allied logistics made visible in trucks, fuel drums, bridge spans, and tired men who kept moving because the road gave them a way to do so. But every door has a cost. And in Burma, each mile had been bought in a currency more intimate than strategy. 1 mile, 1 bridge, 1 more day. The numbers of a road can look lifeless at first. Miles completed, tons delivered, bridges constructed, vehicles moved, dates reached, convoys dispatched. In a report, these figures appear clean, almost calm. They suggest order. They make suffering measurable. They allow commanders to compare effort against result. But every number on the road through northern Burma had mud on it. A mile was not simply a mile. It was trees cut, roots pulled, earth moved, water redirected, machinery repaired, men fed, sick men replaced, bridges tested, and trucks coaxed forward over ground that had not wanted them. A bridge was not simply a bridge. It was a wager that timber, steel, cable, and calculation would hold under the weight of fuel, ammunition, and human need. One failed bridge could stop a convoy. One stopped convoy could delay supplies. One delay could leave a forward unit short of ammunition, medicine, or food. One shortage could change the outcome of a fight that would later be described in simpler terms. This was the mathematics of survival. Modern war often appears on screen through explosions, but it survives through arithmetic. How many gallons? How many rounds? How many trucks? How many days before the road washes out? How many men sick? How many mechanics available? How many spare parts left? How many hours before darkness? How many miles to the next usable crossing? In Burma, numbers became emotional because numbers decided endurance. A rifle company does not care about tonnage in the abstract. It cares whether ammunition arrives before the next attack. A field hospital does not care about supply theory. It cares whether quinine, bandages, plasma, or surgical tools reach the tent before men die. A driver does not care about grand logistics when his truck begins sliding toward the edge of a road cut into a hillside. He cares whether the wheels grip. The road compressed all of this into physical reality. A working drainage ditch could matter more than a speech. A repaired bulldozer could matter more than optimism. A few hundred yards of passable surface could keep an operation alive. The Japanese had understood that Allied armies needed supply. What they underestimated was the determination to solve supply as an active battlefield problem. They expected the jungle to impose delay. The engineers answered delay with construction. They expected rain to break movement. The engineers answered with drainage and repair. They expected rivers to halt traffic. The engineers answered with bridges. Not perfectly, never perfectly. The road was not a magic line drawn through Burma. It was vulnerable, difficult, and often inefficient by the standards of easier theaters. There were arguments after the war about whether it had justified its cost. Some historians questioned the balance between effort and results. Those debates matter. But for the men on the ground, the road's value was not theoretical when a truck arrived where previously only exhausted porters might have struggled through. The difference between carrying and driving is not merely mechanical. It changes scale. It changes tempo. It changes what commanders believe they can attempt. It changes the mental world of soldiers who know that something more than their own backs connects them to the rear. In jungle warfare, morale could collapse under isolation. Men who believed they had been forgotten fought differently from men who heard trucks coming. That sound mattered. The growl of engines in the distance, the clank of gear, the hiss of brakes, the shouted orders as a convoy halted. These were not comforting sounds in themselves. They were noisy, dirty, and often accompanied by fresh work. But they meant connection. They meant the line had not vanished behind them. For Japanese forces, the same sound carried a different meaning. It meant the enemy had found a way to repeat presence. A single Allied attack could be endured. A single patrol could be ambushed. But repeated supply meant the pressure might return tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. The road gave time a different shape. It allowed Allied effort to accumulate rather than dissipate. This was where the Japanese belief began to fail most seriously. They had counted on the jungle to make Allied power temporary. The road made it persistent. Yet persistence required sacrifice at every link. A truck driver might spend hours crawling along a narrow surface, knowing that one mistake could roll the vehicle into a ravine or block the route behind him. Engineers might work knee-deep in water to keep a culvert open while rain hammered their helmets. Mechanics might repair a machine at night with hands so tired they shook. The mathematics of survival had no mercy for exhaustion. If the road failed, the reason did not matter to the men waiting at the other end. A bridge does not hold because builders are brave. It holds because it is built well enough. A truck does not move because the cargo is important. It moves because fuel reaches the engine and tires find ground. A wounded man does not survive because a campaign needs him to. He survives if evacuation, medicine, timing, and luck align. That coldness is part of what made the engineers' work so heavy. They could not replace reality with intention. Every day the road tested them honestly. And every day it held, even imperfectly, Japan's old assumption lost another inch of ground. But the ledger was not only written in miles and tons. It was written in fevers, accidents, graves, and men who came home unable to explain why the sound of rain still made them uneasy. The road took its own casualties. The road did not bleed in the way infantry bled. It had no single face, no single wound, no single moment where its suffering could be photographed and understood. Its casualties appeared gradually, scattered across camps, hospitals, ravines, river crossings, and maintenance yards. A man missing from breakfast, a driver who did not return, a mechanic evacuated with fever, a laborer crushed in an accident, a bridge crew hit by fire, a soldier who woke shaking under a mosquito net and could no longer stand by afternoon. Burma killed in many ways. Enemy bullets were only one of them. Disease moved quietly through units. Malaria could reduce strong men to sweating weakness. Dysentery drained bodies already pushed too far. Skin infections, jungle sores, exhaustion, malnutrition, and accidents added to the toll. Men who had imagined war as combat found themselves fighting their own bodies as much as the enemy. The engineers were not spared because they were builders. Their work often placed them in exposed positions for long hours. They stood on roads that were obvious targets. They repaired bridges that the enemy had reason to destroy. They operated loud machines that announced their location. They worked near edges, water, unstable ground, and heavy equipment in conditions where fatigue made mistakes more likely. A bulldozer could save labor, but it could also crush. A truck could carry supplies, but it could also slide. A cable under tension could snap. A bridge could fail. Mud could trap a vehicle in a place where men became targets while trying to free it. There was nothing theatrical about many of these deaths. That is why they are often forgotten. A man killed by artillery fits the visible language of war. A man lost to fever, accident, or exhaustion becomes easier for history to file away as part of conditions. But conditions are not background. In Burma, conditions were combat. The Japanese soldiers facing the Allies suffered brutally as well. Their own supply lines deteriorated. Food shortages, sickness, isolation, and relentless pressure wore them down. Many Japanese troops fought under orders that left little room for retreat or recovery. They endured hunger and disease in the same unforgiving land they had hoped would protect them. That is one of the bitter truths of this campaign. The jungle served no side gently. Punished everyone. It punished the attacker trying to build through it. It punished the defender trying to survive within it. It punished the wounded, the lost, the underfed, the feverish, and the men whose commanders expected geography to solve what logistics could not. War in Burma resists clean moral framing at the level of the ordinary soldier. A Japanese private in a wet foxhole and an American engineer under a stalled truck did not experience the campaign as a theory. They experienced discomfort, fear, orders, hunger, insects, waiting, and the constant narrowing of life to the next task. For the Allied engineers, the task was always waiting. If a man was sick, another took his place. If a machine failed, someone repaired it. If a bridge washed out, it had to be rebuilt. There was no dramatic pause in the campaign for grief. The road demanded continuity. It absorbed loss and kept asking for labor. That may have been its harshest quality. A battle can end. A road must be maintained. Even after a section was opened, the work did not leave it. Ruts deepened. Shoulders collapsed. Drainage clogged. Heavy trucks damaged surfaces. Rain returned again and again, never impressed by human effort. Engineers who had pushed forward might be called back to fix what had already been declared finished. Men began to understand that progress did not mean escape from the past. Every mile behind them remained capable of failing. In that sense, the road was less like a spear thrust and more like a living thing that had to be fed. It needed gravel, fuel, labor, parts, and vigilance. Punished neglect. It made exhaustion permanent. And yet, along that same road, men also saw evidence that their suffering had meaning. Convoy moving forward. Wounded men moving back. Supplies reaching troops. Aircraft supported. Units sustained. A route where there had been nothing but jungle. That evidence mattered. It did not erase loss. It did not make disease noble or accidents acceptable. It did not turn anonymous labor into glory. But it gave shape to endurance. Men could point to the road and say, however quietly, that their work existed. The Japanese had believed the jungle would break Allied will through hardship. They were partly right about the hardship. They were wrong about the breaking. The engineers bent under Burma. Many suffered. Some died. Some carried the campaign home in ways no official report could measure. But enough of them returned to the machines, the bridges, the culverts, and the endless mud to keep the line open. The shield had not fallen without cost. It had been cut open by men who paid for every mile with pieces of themselves. And when recognition finally came, it came in the language armies often use: reports, numbers, route names, and ceremonies, while many of the men who had done the work remained almost invisible. Commanders learn what engineers already knew. Recognition in war often arrives late, and when it does, it rarely arrives in the form the men imagined. For the engineers of the Burma Road, recognition came through completed mileage, official reports, inspected bridges, convoy records, and eventually the naming of a route that would be remembered as the Ledo Road and later widely associated with Stilwell. Maps began to show what mud had resisted. Commanders could point to the line and speak of achievement. Journalists could describe the scale. Reports could calculate tonnage and progress. But the road had existed first as labor. Before it became a line on a map, it was a man with a shovel clearing drainage in the rain. It was a mechanic tightening a fitting with numb fingers. It was a driver easing a loaded truck across a new bridge while men watched the beams. It was a survey team moving ahead into country where the next bend might conceal enemy fire. It was cooks feeding crews who had no appetite left. It was medics watching fever charts. Armies remember systems more easily than individuals. The road became a system. That was both its triumph and its tragedy. Once it worked, even imperfectly, people could speak of it as if it had been inevitable. Of course the engineers built it. Of course the trucks came through. Of course the bridges held. Of course the route connected. Success has a way of making earlier doubt seem smaller than it felt at the time. But nothing about the road had been inevitable to the men building it. Every section had to be argued into existence. Every bridge had to be made real. Every mile had to survive the first tests of weather and weight. There were no guarantees that the campaign would unfold in a way that justified the effort. There were no guarantees the road would be finished soon enough to matter. There were no guarantees that men would remember the builders once the strategic narrative moved on. commanders did come to understand more deeply that engineering was not secondary work. In Burma, construction was operational power. Roads, airfields, bridges, and supply systems did not merely support combat. They shaped what combat could become. This lesson was not entirely new. Armies had always depended on roads and bridges. Roman legions knew it. Napoleon knew it. Every army that had ever outrun its supplies had learned the hard way. But World War II gave the lesson industrial scale. Mechanized war magnified the importance of movement. The more powerful the army, the more it needed support. In Burma, this truth appeared in harsh relief because the environment stripped away assumptions. A truck was only as useful as the surface beneath it. A supply plan was only as strong as the weakest crossing. A campaign was only as mobile as its engineers could make it. The Japanese had understood part of this, which is why they trusted the jungle in the first place. They knew modern armies could be stopped by terrain. What they did not fully anticipate was the extent to which Allied engineering could turn terrain into a contested variable rather than a fixed verdict. Official realization came in stages. First, the road was necessary. Then, the road was possible. Then, the road was useful. Then, after the worst labor had passed into records, the road became history. For some of the men, that was enough. Soldiers often have a practical relationship with memory. They know what they did. They know who was there. They know who did not come back. Public recognition may matter, but private knowledge can be heavier. For others, obscurity remained painful. They had served far from the most famous battlefields of the war. They had not stormed Normandy, raised flags on Pacific Islands, or flown in formations that filled newsreels. They had fought a campaign of mud, machines, and endurance in a theater many people struggled to locate. Even today, the China-Burma-India theater sits strangely in popular memory. It was enormous, complicated, multinational, and difficult to summarize. Its heroes do not always fit the simple shapes of war storytelling. Its victories came through persistence as much as spectacle. Its suffering was spread across jungle, mountain, road, air route, hospital, and supply depot. That may be why the engineer's story matters. Corrects the frame. It reminds us that war is not only decided where weapons fire, but where supplies move. It reminds us that the men behind the front are not behind the war. They are inside it, carrying a different kind of danger. By the time Allied convoys could move over sections of the route, the original Japanese confidence in the jungle had been forced to confront reality. Terrain had not stopped industrial war power. It had slowed it, wounded it, complicated it, and made it pay dearly. But it had not stopped it. The men who understood that first were not always the commanders reading reports. They were the engineers watching water run across a roadbed and knowing exactly where it would fail if they did nothing. They had known all along that the jungle was not conquered by speeches. It was conquered briefly and imperfectly by maintenance. And that kind of victory rarely looks dramatic until it is gone. The jungle was no longer enough. Long after the engines moved on, the jungle began taking back what men had cut through it. That is what jungle does. Grass grows over edges. Roots enter cracks. Rain softens surfaces. Timber rots. Metal rusts. The clean line of a military road becomes less certain. A place that once shook under trucks returns to insects, leaves, water, and silence. But the lesson did not disappear with the road surface. Burma taught, again and brutally, that geography is powerful but not absolute. Mountains, rivers, jungle, rain, and disease can shape war. They can slow armies, isolate units, and destroy plans. They can give defenders confidence and attackers nightmares. No serious soldier who fought there would say terrain did not matter. It mattered every hour. But terrain was not destiny. That was the part Japanese commanders had misjudged. They believed the jungle's difficulty would remain mostly on their side of the ledger. They believed it would protect, delay, and exhaust the enemy more than it would expose their own vulnerabilities. They believed the Allies would be forced to operate within the limits the land imposed. The engineers proved that limits can move, not vanish. Move. A bridge moves a limit. A road moves a limit. An airstrip moves a limit. A fuel dump, a repair shop, a drainage ditch, a culvert, a convoy schedule, each one shifts what is possible by a small amount. War often turns on those small shifts. Enough of them together can change an entire campaign. The legacy of the road through northern Burma is not that engineering can solve everything. That would be too clean, and Burma was never clean. The road did not end suffering. It did not erase the difficulty of supplying China. It did not make the theater simple or remove controversy from strategic decisions. It did not save every man who needed saving. But it revealed the kind of power that rarely appears in popular memory. The power to continue. The power to repair faster than the environment destroys. The power to connect isolated effort. The power to make tomorrow's movement possible because today's mud was drained. Today's bridge was built. Today's machine was fixed. Today's road did not collapse. Modern armies would carry this lesson forward. In later wars, roads, helicopters, airfields, engineers, construction battalions, logistics hubs, and repair networks would again determine what combat units could actually do. Firepower would matter. Courage would matter. Intelligence would matter. But none of it would escape the old question. Can it be moved, supplied, maintained, and sustained? The Burma engineers answered that question under some of the worst conditions imaginable. Their answer was imperfect. It was expensive. It was exhausting. It was often thankless. But it was real. And reality is what the Warfront Archive idea returns to again and again. What did they believe? What did the battlefield prove when belief met mud, steel, sickness, weather, and time? The Japanese believed the jungle could function as a shield because, in many ways, it had. They were not wrong to respect it. They were wrong to assume the enemy could only suffer inside it, not reshape it. The Americans and their allies did suffer. They suffered deeply. But through that suffering, engineers created the conditions for movement where movement had been assumed nearly impossible. They turned labor into logistics, logistics into pressure, and pressure into a slow erosion of Japanese confidence. The jungle still stood. The road did not defeat nature. It borrowed passage from it at great cost. Perhaps that is the most honest way to understand what happened. The engineers did not conquer Burma in the simple sense. No one conquered that jungle. They forced a temporary agreement from it, paid in sweat, machinery, disease, and lives. For the men who drove the first convoys, for the soldiers waiting at the front, for the wounded moving rearward, that temporary agreement mattered. A road need not last forever to change a war. It only has to exist when history requires passage. And in northern Burma, at a moment when Japan trusted distance, mud, and green darkness to hold the line, men with bulldozers made passage. What the jungle could not stop. Return to the rain. Return to the bulldozer at 4:17 in the morning. The corporal's hand is still slick with oil. The flashlight still trembles. The driver is still waiting in the seat, one boot pressed down, his face half hidden under the wet brim of his helmet. Behind them, the convoy sits in the dark, engines idling when they can, silent when they must be. Ahead, the jungle waits as if nothing human can truly disturb it. For a moment, the whole campaign seems to narrow to a machine that may or may not start. That is how war often feels to the men inside it. Not like history, like a small mechanical failure at the worst possible time. Like a bridge beam bending under weight. Like a radio message broken by static. Like a map that does not match the ground. Like rain that will not stop. The Japanese had believed in the jungle because the jungle had earned belief. It was vast, punishing, and indifferent. It had broken roads before. It had swallowed men. It had turned confidence into exhaustion. It had made powerful armies feel small. But belief, however reasonable, is still tested by reality. And reality in northern Burma came on tracks, wheels, boots, cables, blades, and tired hands. The road did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as work. Slow work. Dangerous work. Work interrupted by weather, enemy fire, disease, mechanical failure, and doubt. Work done by men who were rarely treated as central characters in the war, even when the war could not move without them. They were not perfect men. They were not immune to fear. They complained, broke down, got sick, made mistakes, and endured things no official phrase can fully hold. But they kept building because the road behind them had to reach the road ahead of them, and because somewhere beyond the mud, other men were waiting for what only movement could bring. The Japanese shield did not fail because the jungle became weak. It failed because the Allies learned how to make strength pass through it. That is the quiet brutality of the story. A machine starts again. A bridge holds. A truck moves. Convoy arrives. A defensive assumption dies not in a single flash, but in the repeated sound of engines where silence was expected. By the time the jungle road became a fact, the old belief had already been wounded. Terrain could still kill, could still delay, could still haunt every man who entered it. But it could no longer be trusted to keep the full weight of Allied logistics away. They believed the jungle would stop the war before it reached them. But what really happened was that American engineers, working mile by mile through mud, rain, disease, and danger, turned the jungle itself into a road. Not cleanly, not easily, not without cost, but enough. And sometimes, in war, enough is the difference between a shield and an open door. If you are watching from a place connected to this history, Burma, India, China, America, Britain, or anywhere touched by the long shadow of World War II, share where you are watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family served, built, repaired, carried, flew, or endured during the war, you are welcome to leave their story there as well. Many of these names never made it into the larger histories, but they still belong to the record. Subscribe to WW2 Warfront for more stories of what they believed and what really happened.